All right, let's look at our next power tool. We call it the list comprehension. A list comprehension is a item transformer or filterer. We're going to have to explain that through an example. But basically, we're going to start with a source list and a target list. We're going to go from the source list to the target list, changing each item as we go. Now you may remember that map does this. You may remember that we applied a function to each item in map. We're basically going to do that in a container using map. We're going to basically do the same thing. If I want to transform a list, that is to change each item in the list, I can use a list comprehension. Now what I want to show you first is the way it works in a standard way. Now we could use map for this actually. We could probably use str.rstrip. Maybe not, because rstrip takes another argument. But look closely at this code, and you may want to pause it and read it and see that it makes sense to you, that you can see what it's doing and why we're getting the result that we're getting. Okay, so reading from top to bottom, you can see that on line 2 we have a list of strings. On line 4 we have an empty list. And on line 6 we are looping through the list of strings, stripping each item in the list of strings. So we're stripping it of punctuation. You may remember this is something we had to do in the spell checker. And then appending the stripped word to a new list that we defined before in the for loop. So you can see the result. And in fact, this is, as I said, very similar to what we did in the spell checker. It's something that you might have used a list comprehension for if you had known about it. But this is a very common operation when we want to do the same thing to every item in a container. Very, very common. So common, in fact, that they decided to write a special construct that would allow us to do that without having to write out so many words. You can see we have 4 statements here that are actually doing the work. We have to initialize the list, then we have to do the looping, we have to strip, we have to append, and we might be able to consolidate this down a little bit. But the list comprehension is going to allow us to say it in a single statement without using a for loop, because the for loop will be implicit. As such, we'll be able to use that list comprehension in places that we might not have previously. So let's now look at what the list comprehension will look like. Okay, so here is our list comprehension, and if we work it, you can see that it works in the same way. I'm going to make a slight change just to make sure I'm looking at the latest. Now, what you're seeing on line 4 replaces what you see on lines 6 through 10. And you might want to pause and just stare at it for a second and see if you can see for yourself what it must be doing and how you must be able to read it. Looking at the list comprehension, you can see that a number of the elements in the for loop that we used, pretty standard for loop, are included in the list comprehension, namely the for looping, for W in words, and I guess I could use the word word, but I was worried about getting word off the edge of the page. You can see we have for word in words, and you can see we've got rstrip. What you have implicitly, however, is the append. The append is happening implicitly. It looks like we're looping, and it looks like we're transforming, and we are. But what we're not seeing is that each item that comes back from rstrip is being appended. You can see with rstrip on lines 9 and 10, we assigned it to a name and then passed that name to append. We could even have just done the word.rstrip right here, but that's not the point. The point is the list comprehension will allow us to do it in a single statement. And being a single statement, it means that there are a lot of very interesting places we can put a list of comprehension where 2 or 3 lines of code would not go. 2 or 3 lines of code are multiple statements. This is a single statement. Now, some folks, when they look at this for the first time, say, well, this is confusing. Why don't they just say for word in words, colon word.rstrip? And they certainly could have. I'm not exactly sure why they didn't. It may have been a precedent from, some other language or some other construct. But this is just the way it works. For word in words, word.rstrip. And actually, when we look at the filtering power of list comprehensions, we might see why this list comprehension is built in this way. The basic thing to understand is that a list comprehension is going to deliver a new list based on the old list. The old list is words. The new list will be called strip words. List comprehension implicitly will loop through the old list. We'll implicitly say for word in words. We have to say that, of course, in our code, but list comprehension requires that, so we are going to have to do it. For word in words, what? For word in words, let's do this to every item. Now, again, you may remember this from map, and it might potentially be possible to define a function that does the r-stripping with the quotes and then place that inside the argument to map, although we might have to do some fancy footwork to get that to happen. The fact is, the list comprehension is preferred for doing these kinds of transformations on items within a container.